Not even the boy she was saving. 22 years later, he walked back into her life with $47 million and a decision that would test everything she believed about kindness. Before we begin, type "I remember" in the comments if someone once helped you when no one else did, because this story is about a promise that refused to die. Victoria. Hayes was 9 years old when she first saw him. He was sitting outside the fence of Lincoln Elementary in South Chicago, thin, silent, watching the children eat. Most of them avoided looking at him. Some pointed, some laughed, some whispered. "Homeless?" one boy said. "Creepy," a girl added. Victoria did not see creepy. She saw hunger. The boy looked about 10. His jacket was too thin for November. His hands were shaking. His lips were cracked and pale. When the lunch bell rang, children rushed outside with their trays and lunch boxes. Victoria sat with her peanut butter and jelly sandwich, an apple, and a small juice box. It was all she would eat until dinner. Her grandmother's words echoed in her head. "Baby, we may not have much, but we always share what we got." Victoria stood up. Her friend Jasmine grabbed her sleeve. "Where are you going?" "To the fence." "Don't." "That's weird. He's hungry." "That's not our problem." Victoria did not answer. She walked to the fence slowly. The boy lifted his head when he heard her footsteps. His eyes were hollow, but alert. "Hi," she said softly. "I am Victoria." He swallowed. "Isaiah." She pushed her lunch through. "The metal bars. You can have it." He hesitated for 1 second. Then he grabbed the sandwich and ate it in 4 bites. He did not chew. He devoured. Tears ran down his face while he ate. Victoria stood there, watching, her stomach already tightening from the loss. "Thank you," he whispered. "I'll bring you lunch tomorrow," she said. His eyes widened. "You will?" "I promise." The bell rang. Victoria walked back toward class. She felt hungry, but she also felt something else. Important. The next day. She did it again, and the next and the next by the 2nd week. Isaiah was waiting at the fence before lunch. By the 3rd week. Victoria had stopped eating at school entirely. She told her grandmother. Instead of scolding her, her grandmother packed slightly bigger portions. It meant less for dinner, but no one complained. By the 5th week. Winter came. Isaiah's fingers turned purple in the cold. Victoria brought him her extra sweater. He refused. She forced it through the fence. "Don't argue with me," she said. He smiled for the first time. By December, Isaiah developed a cough. He could barely stand. Victoria ran home, crying. Her grandmother followed her back to the school fence that night with soup and medicine. The medicine was meant for her grandfather. They gave it to Isaiah. For 6 months, Victoria fed him. For 6 months, she watched life slowly return to his face. For 6 months, she chose him over her own comfort. Then one afternoon in early spring, Isaiah did not come. The next day. He was there, eyes red. "They found me a foster home," he said. "I leave tomorrow." Victoria tried to smile. "That's good." He shook his head. "I'll forget everything." "No, you won't." She pulled the red ribbon from her braids. Tore it in half, tied one piece around his wrist. Kept the other. "When you get rich," he said suddenly, voice trembling, "I'm coming back for you." Victoria laughed through tears. "You better." That was the last day she saw him. 22 years passed. Isaiah. Mitchell stood in a glass penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan. $47 million in net worth. Owner of Mitchell Urban Development. 40. Tailored suits. Board meetings. Private drivers. Luxury silence, but every morning. Before coffee, before business, he opened a small drawer. Inside was a glass frame. Inside the frame was a faded red ribbon. He touched it every day. And every day, he asked the same question. Where is she? He had searched for 5 years. Private investigators. Old school records. Property. Searches. Victoria Hayes was a common name. No forwarding address after. 2008, nothing. So he did something irrational. He bought buildings in South Chicago. One by one. Within 2 miles of Lincoln Elementary. He told his board it was long-term community redevelopment. They believed him. Partially. But the truth was simpler. If Victoria still lived in Chicago, she would be near the people who needed help. That was who she was. On a cold Tuesday evening, Isaiah received a reminder. Community board meeting. South Chicago Community Center. 7 p.m. He almost sent a representative. Instead, he typed, "I'll attend personally." He did not know why, but something felt different. Victoria Hayes was now 31, a licensed social worker, still living in South Chicago. Still serving families who slipped through cracks, still wearing half of a faded red ribbon inside a small silver locket. She had tried searching for Isaiah years ago, but records were gone. People disappeared. Life moved on. She never forgot him, but she stopped expecting him that night. She sat in a folding chair inside the community center. The rumor was that a millionaire developer wanted to renovate the neighborhood. She did not trust developers. She had seen what they did. When Isaiah walked in, whispers filled the room. That's him, the one buying property. He's going to raise rent. Isaiah stood at the front and presented architectural slides. Affordable housing, job, programs. Center renovation. Then Victoria stood. How do we know you won't push people out? She asked calmly. Her voice cut through the room. Isaiah froze. The voice? The eyes. He looked at her fully. "May I ask your name?" He said, "Victoria Hayes." The room tilted. His hand gripped the podium. "Did you go to Lincoln Elementary?" He asked quietly. She blinked. Double quotes, yes. "Did you ever feed a boy through the fence?" Her breath caught. Silence fell. "Isaiah?" She whispered. He nodded. "It's me." The room disappeared. 22 years collapsed into one moment. But this is where their story becomes different. Because reunion is not the end. It is the beginning of tension. Victoria did not run into his arms. She did not cry dramatically. She studied him. "You built all this," she said slowly. "Looking for me?" "Partly," he admitted. Her expression changed. "That's dangerous." "Why?" "Because I am not a mission." The room grew still. Isaiah realized something. She had saved him once, but she would not let him save her. And that is where everything truly began. The meeting did not end in applause. It ended in suspicion. Isaiah stood there, hands slightly shaking, while 50 residents stared at him differently now. Not as a developer. Not as a millionaire. But as a man who had once been starving. Dorothy, the board president, cleared her throat. "This is unexpected," she said carefully. "But we still need answers about the project." Victoria did not sit down. She kept her eyes on Isaiah. "You said this development is about affordable housing," she said. "Is it legally locked at current rent levels?" "Yes." "For how long?" 15 years minimum. "With renewal options? And if you sell?" "It transfers with covenant protection." Murmurs filled the room. Victoria nodded once. "Good." Then she sat. Isaiah felt something strange. He had faced billion-dollar negotiations without fear, but her approval mattered more than any board vote. After the meeting, people surrounded them. Some congratulated him. Some questioned him harder. Some whispered that this reunion looked convenient. A reporter from a small local blog approached. "Is this a publicity stunt?" she asked bluntly. Victoria stiffened. Isaiah answered calmly. Double quotes, no. "It is unfinished history." That line would be quoted later. 15 minutes later, they stood alone in a small office. The door closed. For the first time in 22 years, silence sat between them without witnesses. Victoria studied him. "You look different," she said. "So do you." She opened her locket. The faded ribbon rested inside. He removed his keychain. The other half, they held them together. Still a perfect match. Victoria's eyes filled, but she did not step closer. "You built half this neighborhood," she said quietly. "I tried. For me? For what you taught me." She shook her head. "That scares me." "Why?" "Because if this was built on memory, not reality, it can collapse." Isaiah swallowed. "Then let's build something real." Over the next week, they met twice. Publicly, professional tone, community planning. Funding details. Victoria remained guarded. Isaiah noticed everything: the worn heels of her shoes, the way she skipped lunch to answer crisis calls, the way she kept her distance emotionally. One afternoon she asked, "Why didn't you look harder for me sooner?" "I was surviving," he answered honestly. "Foster care was not gentle." She nodded slowly. "I wondered if you forgot." "Never." "People forget. I couldn't." But tension began rising outside them. A local activist group published an article. Millionaire developer uses childhood trauma story to justify gentrification. It spread quickly on social media. Victoria saw it first. Her phone buzzed nonstop. Coworkers asked questions. Board members demanded clarity. That evening, she called Isaiah. "Did you tell the press about us?" "No. They know too much detail." He paused. The community meeting had 50 people. She exhaled slowly. "This complicates things. For you? For the project? For us?" She did not answer. 2 days later, a journalist requested an interview. Isaiah declined. Victoria agreed. When cameras turned on, she spoke calmly. Double quotes. "Yes, I fed him. Yes, we reunited. But this project will stand or fall based on its legal commitments, not our history." The clip went viral locally. Some praised her strength. Others accused her of selling out. Isaiah watched the interview alone in his penthouse. He felt proud and afraid because she was protecting her integrity, not their romance. The first real conflict happened 3 weeks later. A tenant from one of Isaiah's older buildings approached Victoria privately. "My cousin was displaced from a Mitchell property 5 years ago," the woman said. "Rent increased after renovation." Victoria froze. That night she confronted Isaiah. "Is it true?" He did not deflect. "Yes, 5 years ago, before covenant protections. It was legal, but families struggled." She stepped back. "So while you were looking for me, some people lost housing?" His voice was quiet. "I did not understand the impact then. And now? I do." She looked at him long and hard. "You cannot build hope on selective memory, Isaiah." He felt the weight of it. "You're right." Silence filled the space between them. "For this to work," she continued, "you have to acknowledge harm. Publicly. That will damage investor trust. It might." He looked at her. "You're asking me to risk millions." "I'm asking you to risk your image." The choice hung heavy. The next community meeting was packed. Media present, cameras ready. Isaiah stepped forward before presentation. "I need to address something." He began. He explained past rent increases, explained profit motives, explained what he had learned. "I cannot undo those decisions, but I can structure this project differently." The room went silent. Victoria watched closely. He did not blame market forces. He did not deflect. He owned it. That night, something shifted. Trust did not fully bloom, but it cracked open. Their personal tension remained. One evening, after a long planning session, Isaiah offered to drive her home. Halfway there, she said quietly, "You know, I cannot be rescued." "I don't want to rescue you." "Then what do you want?" He answered without hesitation. "To walk beside you." She studied him. "That sounds good." "It is, but it's harder than it sounds." He smiled faintly. "I survived worse." She did not smile back. "This is different." 3 months passed. The project moved slowly. funding secured. Legal protections drafted. A youth support program designed jointly. Not as charity. Is structure. But the media story kept growing. One national outlet contacted them. From starving boy to millionaire developer reunited with childhood hero. Isaiah hesitated. Victoria declined. This cannot become a fairy tale, she said. It already is to some people, he replied. Then we correct the narrative. And then came the rupture. At a public hearing, a rival developer accused Isaiah openly. This emotional story is manipulation, he said into the microphone. A distraction from corporate expansion. The room buzzed. Victoria felt eyes on her. Isaiah stood to respond, but she raised her hand first. This project is not about romance, she said clearly. It is about enforceable community protection. If those protections fail, I will oppose it myself. The statement stunned him. After the meeting, he confronted her. You undermined me. I protected credibility. You made it sound like you don't trust me. I trust structure more than emotion. The words hit harder than she intended. He turned away slightly. So, what are we then? She answered softly. Two people who survived something rare, trying not to ruin it. That night, they did not speak. Isaiah stood alone in his apartment. He removed the ribbon from its frame. For the first time in 22 years, he felt unsure. Did she love him? Or only the memory? Meanwhile, Victoria lay awake in her small apartment. She touched the ribbon in her locket. She feared one thing more than poverty. Power imbalance. She did not want to become a symbol. She wanted partnership. The next morning, Isaiah called his legal team. I want the community board to have veto authority on rent changes for this development. That reduces control, his lawyer said. I know. Investors may withdraw. Then we adjust. He hung up. Then he called Victoria. Lunch, he said simply. She agreed. When they met, he slid a document across the table. Read Clause 12. She did. Her eyes widened. You're giving the board oversight. Yes. She looked up. Why? Because I need you to know I am building with you, not above you. For the first time since reunion, her walls softened. You're stubborn, she said. So are you. A small smile appeared, and something steadier began forming. Not fairy tale. Foundation. This is the midpoint. From here, we build toward impact, not explosive viral exaggeration. Earned momentum, but tension is not finished. Because success attracts pressure. And pressure reveals character. The real test did not come from the community. It came from money. 3 weeks after, Isaiah added the community veto clause. His largest investor requested a private meeting. The boardroom was silent except for the sound of leather chairs. Shifting. Richard, his longtime business partner, closed the glass door. You're destabilizing the project, Richard said. I'm stabilizing trust. Isaiah replied. You just handed decision power to people who don't understand market pressure. They understand displacement. That's not how development works. Isaiah leaned forward. Maybe that's the problem. Richard stared at him. Are you doing this because it's right or because of her? Isaiah did not hesitate. Both. Richard exhaled sharply. If we lose funding, it won't just affect you. It affects employees, contractors, jobs. I know. You're risking millions. I survived worse. Richard shook his head. This isn't the street anymore, Isaiah. This is leverage, and I'm choosing where to place it. 2 days later, one investor pulled out. It was not catastrophic. But it was a signal. The news leaked. Headlines shifted tone. Mitchell Project faces financial uncertainty after structural changes. Victoria saw it immediately. She did not call him. She went to his office. When she walked in, he looked tired. You didn't tell me? She said. It's manageable. You lost funding because of that clause. Yes. She sat down across from him. You did not have to do that. I did. Why? He met her eyes. Because if this fails, I need it to fail for the right reasons. She felt something move in her chest. You would really let it collapse? If collapse means refusing to build it wrong, yes. Silence filled the office. Not. Tense. Heavy. This is bigger than us, she said quietly. I know. And that's why I cannot be the reason you sacrifice stability. You're not. You're part of it, yes. The honesty did not scare her this time. It steadied her. But pressure continued. Building. Another outlet picked up the investor story. Comment sections split. Some called Isaiah naive. Some called him manipulative. Some accused Victoria of influencing. Business Decisions, a nonprofit watchdog group, demanded transparency. Victoria faced criticism at the community center. One parent said, "You're too close to him to stay objective." That one hurt. That night, she called him. "We need distance." Publicly, she said, "Distance? Yes. For how long?" "Until the project stabilizes." He absorbed it. "So we pretend. We protect it." He nodded slowly. "That's what it takes." The next few weeks felt colder. Meetings remained. Professional calls were shorter. They did not sit close. They did not linger, but something stronger was forming under the restraint. Respect. Then came the real crisis. City Zoning Committee delayed final approval. Not rejection. Delay. Investors hesitated further. Construction paused. The press framed it as failure. Victoria saw fear spreading in the neighborhood. If this collapses, people will lose hope again. She told him. I know. What's the backup? He looked at her directly. I fund phase 1 privately. She blinked. That's a large risk. Yes. You'd shoulder it alone? Yes. Why? Because I was once a phase 1 risk. She did not speak for several seconds. Then she said something that changed everything. If you do that, I'm stepping in fully. What does that mean? I'll help design and lead the youth initiative directly. No part-time involvement. Full commitment. He studied her. That's a career shift. Yes, it reduces your independence. It increases impact. And if we fail, then we fail honestly. For the first time since reunion, they were aligned without tension. Isaiah funded phase 1 privately. It made headlines. Some praised him. Some called it reckless. But construction began. Quietly. No gala. No. Grand announcement. Just work. Meanwhile, Victoria drafted the structure of what would become the Red Ribbon Youth Program. Not national. Not explosive. Local. Focus. Transitional housing for youth aging out of foster care. Education. Assistance. Job placement partnerships. Mental health access. Small. Scale. 20 participants. First year. Measured. Intentional. 1 evening. After reviewing budgets late, Victoria looked up from the conference table. You realize something? She said. What? If this works, it's not because of money. It's because of structure and trust. He nodded. Trust. She hesitated. Do you regret coming back? He answered immediately. No. Even with all this? Yes. She looked down. I was afraid you loved the girl who fed you, not the woman I became. He walked closer. I love the courage. That hasn't changed. She swallowed. I am not that 9-year-old. I know. And I will challenge you. I expect you to. And I will disagree publicly if needed. I want you to... Her voice softened. That's new. What? Being wanted. For strength, not softness. He reached for her hand slowly. I did not survive because you were soft. I survived because you were strong. This time, she did not pull away, but they still had one more test. A journalist uncovered the old displaced. Tennant's story again. This time with names, faces, interviews, the narrative returned. Can a former displacer become a savior? Victoria read the article twice. Then she went to see the family. Mentioned not for optics, for understanding, she listened, she apologized, she returned to Isaiah with clarity. You need to meet them, she said. I will. And not for cameras. He nodded. He did not know press. No announcement, just accountability. The family did not forgive easily. But they listened, and so did he. That quiet act shifted something deeper than headlines. It shifted conscience. 3 months later, the first building phase was complete. 20 housing units ready. Not luxury. Not flashy. Functional. Protected by covenant. The youth program opened applications. One of the applicants was Marcus. 17. Aging out in 8 months. No family. Anger in his eyes, Victoria interviewed him personally. Why do you want in? She asked. Because I'm tired of surviving. She saw Isaiah in him instantly. He was accepted. The first month was rocky. Marcus skipped classes, argued with staff, nearly quit. Isaiah met him one evening, told him about sleeping in a car. About hunger. About the ribbon. Marcus did not cry, but he listened. 3 weeks later, Marcus showed up to job training early. Change was slow, but real. The program stabilized. Investors slowly returned, not all, but enough. The media story shifted from scandal to resilience. Still divided, but softer. In one evening, standing inside the finished community center renovation, Victoria looked around. New heating. Clean walls. Children laughing in the hallway. She turned to Isaiah. This is enough, she said. For now. For now. He reached into his pocket. Not for a ring, for the ribbon. He untied it from his keychain. For 22 years, I carried this waiting for perfect timing, he said. There is no perfect timing, she replied. I know. He stepped closer. I don't want to marry you because I owe you. She held his gaze steady. I don't want to marry you because you're rich. He smiled faintly. I want to marry you because every time pressure rises, you choose integrity. She exhaled slowly. And I want to marry you because when challenged, you choose growth. No stage. No cameras. No kneeling. Just quiet truth. Yes. She said. Not dramatic. Certain. The opening ceremony of the youth housing was small. 20. Chairs. Community members. The previously displaced family attended. So did Marcus. Victoria spoke. First, this is not a miracle. It is a responsibility. Isaiah followed. Kindness is not charity. It is structure. No standing ovation. Just steady applause. Marcus moved into his unit that night. He stood inside the small apartment and whispered, I have a door. Victoria heard him and smiled. Months later, Marcus passed his GED. Got into a welding program. Not viral. Not national news. Just one life-shifting direction. That was enough. 1 year later, the program served 32 youth. Retention rate high. Funding stable. No national replication yet, but strong foundation. On their wedding day, they returned to Lincoln Elementary. The fence still stood. Rusty. Familiar. They tied a new red ribbon to it. No cameras. No documentary crew. Just two people honoring a beginning. A young girl stood nearby watching them. She looked hungry. Victoria walked over. Hi, she said softly. The cycle did not explode into 34 cities. It continued quietly. One decision at a time. If you are watching this and you once survived because someone saw you, type, I remember. If you have something small to give it. You may never see the return, but return happens. Not always in millions. Sometimes in dignity. Sometimes in doors that lock safely at night. Sometimes in a ribbon that never stopped meaning something.
The wedding was quiet. No ballroom, no magazine feature, no celebrity guests. Just 100 chairs set up on cracked pavement behind Lincoln Elementary. The same fence still stood, rusted, bent in places, unchanged by time. Victoria ran her fingers along the metal before the ceremony began. 22 years, she whispered. Isaiah stood beside her. I almost didn't survive long enough to see today. She looked at him sharply. You did survive. Because of you. No, she corrected gently, because you chose to. He didn't argue, because now he understood something he had not understood as a boy. She had opened a door. He had walked through it. Their vows were simple. No dramatic promises. No exaggerated forever speeches. Victoria said, "When I was 9, I did not know what your life would become. I only knew you were hungry. Today I don't marry a millionaire. I marry a man who learned to feed others." Isaiah said, "When I was 10, I believed I was invisible. You proved I was not. Today I promise to see you fully, not the girl who saved me, the woman who challenges me." There was no standing ovation, just quiet tears. Marcus stood in the back row, watching, absorbing, learning what partnership looked like. 3 weeks after the wedding, something unexpected happened. Funding tightened again. Not because of scandal, because of economic downturn. 2 mid-level investors froze commitments across multiple projects. The Red Ribbon Youth Housing Program was stable for now, but expansion plans halted. Victoria studied the numbers late one night. "If we stay at 32 youth capacity," she said quietly, "we'll have to turn away at least 60 applicants this year." Isaiah leaned back in his chair. "How many are emergency cases?" 21. Silence filled the office. He knew that number, 21 lives waiting. Victoria spoke again. "I can't save everyone. You're not meant to, but I see their faces." He nodded. "I know." She turned toward him. "You once told me that hope needs structure. What happens when structure runs out?" Isaiah did not answer immediately. He stood and walked to the window. Lake Michigan reflected the city lights below. "I build phase 2 smaller," he said finally. "Smaller. Lower overhead, modular units, fewer aesthetic upgrades, more capacity." Victoria's eyes sharpened. "You're cutting design quality." "I'm cutting pride." She exhaled slowly. "Will it pass zoning?" "It won't be easy." She stepped closer. "You'll take heat. I've taken worse." The proposal for modular expansion hit resistance. City officials questioned safety. Competitors whispered about shortcuts. One columnist wrote, "Mitchell's redemption project now cutting corners?" Victoria felt anger rise when she read it. But Isaiah surprised her. He requested a public forum, not defensive, transparent. On stage, he explained cost analysis, fire safety data, long-term sustainability. Then he did something no developer typically did. He opened the floor and listened. A mother stood up. "If you build this cheaper housing, will my son be safe there?" Isaiah paused, then answered clearly, "Yes, because we are not cutting safety. We are cutting vanity." That line circulated, not viral, but respected. Approval passed, narrow margin, but enough. Meanwhile, Marcus struggled again. Welding training intensified. He nearly dropped out. Victoria found him sitting outside the center one evening. "I don't belong here," he muttered. "Why? Everyone else has family." She sat beside him. "You think I had one?" He looked at her. "You're different." "No," she said softly. "I had a grandmother, but I also had fear, and I almost quit school once." He blinked. "You?" "Yes." "What changed?" "Someone believed quitting would waste my potential." Marcus stared at the pavement. "And you believe that about me?" "I wouldn't be here if I didn't." He didn't respond. But the next morning, he showed up early. 6 months later, Phase 2 housing opened. 48 youth capacity, no media fanfare, but local families noticed, teachers noticed. Police reports in the area showed slight decline in youth-related disturbances. Small shifts, meaningful shifts. One evening, Victoria found Isaiah alone in the finished hallway. "You're thinking," she said. "Yes? Regret? No. Then what? I used to believe success meant numbers, scale, headlines, cities. And now?" Now I think success means knowing Marcus won't sleep outside. She smiled. That's growth. He looked at her. You forced it. No, she corrected gently. You allowed it. But pressure returned in a different form. National attention finally arrived. A morning news show requested a segment. From homeless child to developer changing foster care. Isaiah hesitated. Victoria did not. If we go on air, she said, we control the narrative. What narrative? That kindness is not romantic. It is disciplined. He agreed. The interview aired live. The host asked the obvious question. Do you believe love saved you? Isaiah answered calmly. Love gave me an anchor. Discipline built the rest. Victoria added, and community accountability keeps it steady. The segment was balanced, not exaggerated, but donations increased slightly. Not millions, but enough to stabilize year-end operations. The true emotional climax came not from funding, but from confrontation with past trauma. One winter evening, Isaiah received a call. His former foster placement coordinator was retiring. She wanted to meet. He had not spoken to anyone from that period in 20 years. Victoria encouraged him. You cannot outrun your own history, she said. The meeting was uncomfortable. The coordinator admitted system failures, overcrowded placements, budget cuts, limited oversight. I'm sorry, she said. Isaiah listened, not with anger, but with clarity. I survived, he said, but many didn't. He left that meeting changed, not angry, but determined. The next board meeting of Red Ribbon, he proposed something new. Policy advocacy, limited, local, for transitional funding reform. Victoria supported it, but cautiously. We cannot overextend. We won't. It was not a political crusade. It was targeted structural improvement. That subtle expansion increased credibility. On their first anniversary, they did not throw a party. They returned to the fence again, this time with Marcus. He held a red ribbon in his hand. Why do you keep coming back here? He asked. Victoria answered. Because we started small, Isaiah added, and we stay small in memory, even when impact grows. Marcus tied the ribbon himself. He did not cry, but he stood taller. 2 years after Phase 2, the program served 73 youth. Retention remained high, funding stable, not explosive growth, but consistent. Marcus graduated welding school, full-time job, $44,000 annual salary. He moved into independent housing outside program support. Before leaving, he handed Victoria a card. You didn't save me, he said awkwardly. You gave me tools. She hugged him tightly. Isaiah watched quietly. This was what $47 million could not buy, witnessing transformation. One quiet evening, Victoria sat at her desk reviewing old intake forms. She found her original application to social work school. The essay question read, What changed your understanding of responsibility? She had written about a boy outside a fence. She showed it to Isaiah. He read it slowly. You never told me this, he said. I didn't need to. He looked at her. You didn't just feed me? I know. You shaped yourself in that moment too. She smiled softly. We shaped each other. The story did not end with fireworks. It continued in meetings, in spreadsheets, in late-night problem-solving, in arguments about budget allocation, in compromise, in choosing integrity when no one watched. One final scene, a new girl entered the program, 8 years old, temporary emergency placement, quiet, watching. Victoria knelt beside her. Hi, she said gently. I'm Victoria. The girl whispered her name. Isaiah stood a few steps behind. He did not step forward immediately. He had learned. Support does not rush. It steadies. Victoria asked the girl softly, Are you hungry? The girl nodded. Victoria stood. Isaiah walked toward the kitchen. He prepared a sandwich, placed it carefully on a plate. Not dramatic, not symbolic, just food. He handed it to the child. She ate slowly. Victoria glanced at Isaiah. He met her eyes. No words needed. The cycle had not exploded into legend. It had matured into discipline. And discipline sustains change. If someone once saw you when you felt invisible, type, I remember. If you have something small to give, give it. Not for applause, not for headlines, for structure, for dignity, for doors that close safely at night, for children who believe quitting is easier, for futures that do not announce themselves loudly. A sandwich changed one life. Structure changed many. Kindness is not magic. It is maintenance. And maintenance is love in action. The truth about change is this: it becomes boring before it becomes powerful. The third year tested them more than the first two combined. Donor fatigue began quietly. Economic strain returned. One foundation reduced grants by 30% across all youth initiatives. Red Ribbon felt it immediately. Victoria reviewed payroll. Staff reductions may be necessary. Isaiah shook his head. We reduce expansion instead. That caps capacity. It protects quality. They debated for hours. Voices raised once. Silence stretched twice. Then compromise formed. Scaled hiring freeze. Increased volunteer recruitment. Community partnerships expanded. It was not glamorous, but it worked. A retired teacher volunteered tutoring twice a week. A small business offered apprenticeship slots. The structure widened laterally instead of vertically. That decision saved the program from overextension. During that year, Isaiah faced his own private reckoning. He realized something uncomfortable. He still measured his worth against wealth. Quietly, internally. When numbers dipped, he felt personal failure. Victoria noticed. "You're not the balance sheet," she told him one night. He didn't answer. "You survived without money once," she continued. "Yes." "So why are you afraid of smaller numbers?" He looked at her honestly. "Because I don't want to ever feel powerless again." She stepped closer. Power is not in control, it's in consistency. He absorbed that slowly. She was right. Again. Year 4 brought stabilization, a moderate economic rebound, new mid-level donors, a state partnership for transitional housing matching funds. Red Ribbon did not expand nationally, it strengthened locally. That was intentional. Quality over scale. Marcus returned as a guest speaker, standing taller, speaking calmly. "I thought surviving was the goal," he told a room of new participants. "But building is better." Victoria felt tears. Isaiah felt pride, not ownership, pride in resilience. On a late autumn evening, Isaiah and Victoria walked past the old fence again. It had been partially replaced during school renovation, but a small preserved section remained. Ribbons faded from weather, some torn, some still bright. Victoria touched one gently. "Do you ever wish it had gone viral?" she asked quietly. He thought carefully. "No." "Why?" "Because viral fades. And this lasts." She nodded. "And we lasted." He smiled. "Yes, we did." They stood there in comfortable silence, not as savior and saved, not as symbol and story, but as two people who chose discipline over drama. And that choice carried further than headlines ever could.